I couldn't wrap my head around what I was seeing. Erice, my wife of 5 years, was sitting half-naked on another man's lap in a hot tub, completely unfazed. It was painfully clear what they were up to, judging by their expressions and the way they were all over each other. My blood was boiling, and without thinking, I whipped out my phone and recorded a quick video. For a moment, I thought about putting on my swim trunks and joining them, but I decided against it. Instead, I sat in the room, trying to figure out why she hadn't wanted me at this party in the first place. Erice had been working as a secretary at SG Funds, a hedge fund company, for about a year now. She seemed happy, almost too happy, and now I knew why. Earlier that week, I had stumbled upon a text on her phone about a Christmas party the company was throwing, with an invite that included a +1. When I mentioned it to her, she tried to brush it off, saying I'd probably be bored stiff, surrounded by financial types talking about numbers. That didn't sit right with me, so I asked her straight up if she was embarrassed to be seen with me. She denied it, claiming it wasn't that. She just thought I wouldn't have a good time. Those company parties were apparently a regular thing, happening every month, and she was always out until the early morning hours or sometimes not even home until the next day. I never questioned it before, but now things were starting to make sense. When she said it would probably bore me, I just went along with it, not wanting to cause any drama. But then she mentioned, almost like an afterthought, that if I did decide to go, I'd better make sure my tux was ready. Still, she warned me that I probably wouldn't enjoy myself. On the day of the party, she suggested I bring my swim trunks. I found it odd. Swim trunks? At a Christmas party in December? She quickly explained that after the main event, they usually went up to her boss's penthouse, which had a hot tub. I shrugged it off, but it was clear by the way she said it that this wasn't anything new. Before we left, she made me promise I'd be on my best behavior. That left me wondering why she even felt the need to say that. But I told her I'd behave, though I already had a bad feeling about the night. Curious, I asked why she was suddenly telling me all this. She hesitated before explaining that these parties could get a little crazy, and she didn't want me to overreact. Apparently, the guys that were a bit too friendly and had a habit of getting handsy. I tried to stay calm and told her as long as things didn't cross the line, I'd be fine. She just smiled, kissed my cheek, and said nothing. At the party, she introduced me to her friend Rachel, proudly telling her that I was her husband. Rachel gave me this odd smile, then made a snide remark about it being fun, and called Erice a wild and crazy girl. The way she said it made my stomach churn, but Erice just giggled like it was no big deal. She told me she needed to mingle and asked Rachel to go grab drinks for the two of them. Just like that, they were gone, not even bothering to look back at me. I made my way to the bar, ordered her wine, and grabbed a beer for myself, then went looking for her. But no matter how hard I searched, she was nowhere to be found. After half an hour, I gave up and sat at an empty table, hoping she'd eventually come find me. As I sat there watching people dance and laugh, I felt completely invisible, like I didn't even exist. She was right about one thing. I wasn't having any fun. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. My wife had practically ditched me. After sitting there for what felt like hours nursing my beer, I decided to call it a night. If she wasn't going to bother spending time with me, then I might as well head home. As I was about to leave, Erice and Rachel finally showed up, laughing and hanging off three guys. One of them had his arm wrapped around her waist like it was nothing. She acted like she hadn't just left me hanging for 2 hours, greeting me with a tipsy, "Oh, there you are." She kissed me, and I could taste the mix of tequila and something else on her lips. I didn't say anything right away, but I let her know I was heading home since she'd ditched me. I asked where she had been all this time, and she blushed, avoiding eye contact while the guys just grinned like they were in on some inside joke. Rachel casually mentioned they'd been doing shots. Erice seemed confused by her explanation, and I was left wondering what had really happened. I asked her directly about the shots and why her breath tasted like something more than just tequila. She brushed it off and told me they were heading to Mark's place, where the hot tub was ready. She asked if I was coming along. I told her I would, but only if I'd actually get to spend time with her this time around. She laughed it off, saying not to be silly and that I'd see her later. Then, instead of riding with me, she hopped in the car with Rachel and the guys, as if I didn't even exist. One of the guys even grabbed her hand and pulled her away, which only made me angrier. I followed them in my car, and when we got there, Erice was already in a bikini, laughing it up in the hot tub with two guys I hadn't met before, Mark and Tom, the so-called senior partners at the firm. They acted like overgrown frat boys. Rachel came up to me, asking if I wanted to get together later. I was stunned and told her flat out that I was married. She acted surprised, saying she thought we had an open marriage because of the way Erice had been acting with the guys. Confused, I asked her what she meant by that. That's when Rachel dropped the bomb. Erice had already been with both Mark and Tom. Disgusted, I felt sick to my stomach. Rachel's face changed when she saw my reaction and muttered, "Oh my God! You didn't know, did you?" I shook my head, and she hesitantly told me it had been going on for over a year, ever since Erice started working at SG Funds. I was absolutely floored, trying to wrap my mind around what Rachel had just told me. All this time, Erice had been fooling around with these guys, and I had been none the wiser. My thoughts raced as I asked Rachel if this was what Erice had been up to at these so-called company parties. Rachel reluctantly admitted that Erice wasn't just involved with two guys. There had been others, too. She apologized, assuming I had already known. Then, as if trying to soften the blow, she told me that despite everything, Erice really did love me. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly at that, asking sarcastically how I was supposed to feel all that love. Rachel suggested I go upstairs and get changed, thinking maybe Erice would behave herself if I was around. I rolled my eyes at the idea, but headed up anyway. That's when I saw her, Erice, with those same two guys, shamelessly carrying on. My heart clenched, but this time, the anger won out. Despite everything I'd felt for her, I just couldn't stomach it anymore. I made up my mind to confront her. I stormed downstairs, and as soon as I hit the bottom of the steps, Erice noticed me. She acted like nothing was wrong, asking why I wasn't in my swim trunks yet, and if I was planning to join them in the hot tub. I grabbed her arm and pulled her into a room away from everyone else, slamming the door behind us. I demanded to know if she ever planned on telling me about this so-called open marriage she was apparently in. I told her what Rachel had revealed, and showed her the video I'd recorded of her in the hot tub with those guys. I needed answers. Erice brushed it off like it was no big deal, telling me they were just having fun and that it didn't mean anything. I was shocked at her audacity. To me, it meant everything. I took off my wedding ring and put it in her hand, then slid her rings off her finger too. She looked confused, asking what I was doing. I told her flat out that I found what she had done revolting and that I couldn't stand the sight of her anymore. I wished her a cold Merry Christmas, mentioned I'd be seeing a lawyer on Monday, and told her not to even think about coming back home. She started begging, saying she loved me, but I was already numb. I told her I didn't care anymore. I knew the truth now, knew why she hadn't wanted me at the party in the first place. With that, I left her standing there. As I headed for the door, one of the guys, who cares which one, called out, asking why I was leaving so early and making some joke about Erice. Without turning back, I casually replied that she was their problem now. I left the penthouse, got in my car, and drove home, ignoring the flood of calls and texts Erice sent my way. By the time I got home, I had made up my mind. I deleted all her messages and blocked her number. Then, I went to work. I threw on some old clothes, grabbed a bunch of trash bags, and started packing up all of her stuff. I tossed everything into her car, pulled it out of the garage, and changed the code on the door so she couldn't get back in. By the time I was done, it was 2:30 in the morning, and I was exhausted. I collapsed onto the bed and fell asleep instantly. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of the house phone ringing. Without thinking, I answered with a tired yeah, and of course it was Erice. She was asking me to come pick her up. I told her flatly that she wasn't my problem anymore. She tried to get me to talk, but I shut it down, telling her that if she had anything to say, she could go through my lawyer. I let her know her car was packed with her things and waiting in my parking spot, then hung up on her. She called right back, but I disconnected the phone. I had no interest in hearing her voice ever again. I crawled back into bed and passed out. When I finally woke up that afternoon, I checked outside. Her car was gone. Good. Maybe she finally got the message. I knew what I had to do next, so I hopped online and started researching divorce lawyers and the laws in our state. Luckily, since we didn't own any property together and had no kids, the process wouldn't be too complicated. She made about the same as me, maybe even a bit more, so I wasn't worried about alimony either. I did learn that I could file for divorce on the grounds of infidelity, which would make things messier and more expensive. But I didn't care. I found the number for a lawyer named Sarah Cooper and made a note to call her on Monday. While I was jotting down notes, my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but I answered anyway. Turned out to be Rachel. She told me Erice was staying with her for a few days and asked if I was really going through with the divorce. I confirmed it. Rachel sounded worried, saying Erice was a wreck, crying in her room and acting like she was on the verge of a breakdown. I stayed calm, telling her that Erice had done this to herself. Rachel asked if I still had any feelings for Erice, and I told her exactly how I felt. Nothing but disgust and hate at this point. I reminded her that Erice had been cheating on me for over a year, and now she had the nerve to embarrass me in front of everyone. It was over. Rachel tried to tell me Erice still loved me, but I wasn't buying it. I asked her point blank, did Erice sleep with Mark and Tom after I left that night? She hesitated but finally admitted that yeah, they had gotten together after I left, to console her. She even suggested that maybe I would have enjoyed the night if I had stuck around. I was stunned by her audacity and hung up after telling her I didn't want to hear any more of her nonsense. A little while later, I noticed 2 text messages from numbers I didn't recognize. They had come in while I was asleep. I opened the first one, and it said, "Missed one hell of a party, bro." Attached was a video. When I played it, my stomach turned. It was Erice again in the hot tub, fooling around with 3 men this time. Mark, Tom, and some other guy I didn't recognize. The guy I didn't know looked directly into the camera and smirked. "That's quite the wife you've got there, bro." The guy sneered, grinning at the camera. "Too bad you missed out." I clenched my fist as I watched the second video. It was more of the same. Erice shamelessly involved with the men, but this time it ended with Mark holding my wedding ring. Erice, standing beside him with a smirk, opened her hand to show the ring as if it was some kind of trophy. My hatred for her grew deeper with each second. I immediately transferred both videos to my computer and made backup copies to give to my lawyer. For a moment, I seriously considered sending them to all of her friends and family, letting everyone see exactly what she was. But I hesitated. According to what I read on Sarah's website, I had to be careful. Reacting badly to her betrayal could end up hurting my case in court. So, I decided to hold off for now. Thankfully, Erice and Rachel didn't contact me for the rest of the weekend, and that was just fine by me. I used the time to completely erase Erice from the apartment, purging any trace of her existence. Monday morning came, and I called my boss to explain the situation. He was surprisingly empathetic, having been through something similar with his own unfaithful wife. He gave me some time off, no questions asked. That afternoon, I had my appointment with Sarah. On the way, I stopped by the bank to take care of disentangling Erice from our finances. I settled our joint credit card, canceled it, and withdrew half of our shared assets to open an account solely in my name. By the time I walked into Sarah's office, I was ready to take the next steps. She explained the divorce laws and suggested we could go after Erice's employer with an alienation of affection lawsuit. While the outcome wasn't guaranteed, given the evidence I had, she was confident we had a solid case. We also discussed the best way to serve the divorce papers. I decided it would be fitting for them to be delivered at her office. Let her and her colleagues feel a bit of the public humiliation they had inflicted on me. I paid Sarah her retainer, then left the office feeling like a small weight had been lifted off my shoulders. As I was driving home, my phone rang. The name on the screen made me groan, Rachel. I answered, and she immediately suggested I meet with Erice that afternoon. I shut that idea down quickly. Sarah had advised me to keep my distance, and I wasn't about to ignore that. Rachel tried pushing Erice's contact info on me, but I redirected her to Sarah. She kept pressing, saying Erice was a mess, crying nonstop and on the verge of breaking down. But I didn't budge. I told Rachel there was no chance of reconciliation, and Erice should expect divorce papers soon. After ending the call, I made a quick stop to pick up a 12-pack of beer and a couple of packs of cigarettes. I hadn't smoked since we got married, but at that moment, I needed something to stop myself from doing something reckless. Once home, I cracked open a beer and sat down to figure out my next steps. Later, the house phone rang again. I picked it up, and Mark Thompson, Erice's boss, was on the other end. He identified himself, sounding more professional than he had at the party. I recognized his voice and asked what he wanted. He said he knew I was upset about what happened on Friday and claimed that everyone thought I was okay with my wife's behavior at these company events. I cut him off, asking if he knew she was married this whole time. He admitted he did, but said Erice told them we had an open marriage, so he assumed I was fine with it. I was furious. I pointed out that no one had bothered to ask me about any of this. I also brought up the videos, wanting to know if he had any clue how disgusting that was. Mark stammered a bit and claimed that the videos were Erice's idea, then apologized for the whole situation. He asked if there was anything he could do to make it right. That's when I laid out my terms. First, he would testify against her in court. Second, I planned to sue him and his company for alienation of affection. He needed to accept that, no arguments. Mark sounded nervous, asking if I was really going to sue them. I made it clear that they had violated their own morals clause and destroyed my marriage. He tried to brush it off, saying they hadn't meant any harm, and it was just fun. I couldn't believe the nerve of this guy. He suggested we could work through it, but I shut him down. I told him that his problems weren't my concern and ended the call. Frustrated, I grabbed another beer and stepped out onto the balcony for a smoke. The next few days were quiet, but on Wednesday, things took a turn. Sarah's office served Erice with the divorce papers at her job. Rachel called me shortly after, outraged. She accused me of humiliating Erice without giving her a chance to explain. I told her I didn't care about Erice's feelings anymore, and I didn't want to hear from her again. I slammed the phone down. But of course, that wasn't the end of it. A few minutes later, I got a call from Mark's office number. I answered, already irritated. Mark wasted no time insulting me, threatening to kick my ass and swearing he'd ruin my life for what I'd done. I hung up and immediately called Sarah to tell her about the threat. She didn't seem surprised. Good, she said. I'll file for a temporary restraining order against Erice and her friends. I'll make sure you get a copy. I asked her what I should do if Mark actually came after me. She told me to keep my cool, make sure there were witnesses, and not to do anything rash. I took her advice to heart. Later that afternoon, there was a knock on the door. It was the courier delivering the TRO, just like Sarah promised. I wasn't taking any chances, though, so I went ahead and bought a small motion-activated camera to keep an eye on the front room. I also made sure to keep a trusty Louisville Slugger near the door, just in case. If Mark or any of his buddies came looking for trouble, I'd be ready. The rest of the week passed quietly enough. I didn't hear a peep from Rachel, Erice, or any of her boyfriends. At least, not until Saturday night. I was sitting on my balcony, beer in one hand and a cigarette in the other, when the doorbell rang. Almost immediately, there was loud pounding on the door. I stubbed out my cigarette, made my way to the front room, and looked through the peephole. Sure enough, it was Mark, and he had someone else with him. The pounding continued as Mark yelled for me to open up, claiming I was violating a restraining order. Calmly, I told him I was calling the police, and as expected, he protested, still banging on the door, demanding I let him in. I dialed 911 and explained the situation to the operator, who told me that multiple calls had come in about this and that officers were already en route. She advised me not to open the door until they arrived, and I agreed, ending the call. The pounding didn't stop, and for a moment, I wondered if Mark was actually going to try to break the door down. I tightened my grip on the bat, ready for anything. Soon, I heard a commotion. Peeking through the peephole again, I saw two big police officers putting handcuffs on Mark and the guy with him. One of the officers knocked on the door and introduced himself. I opened up, and Mark shot me a look of pure venom as they led him to the cruiser, still hurling threats. The officer asked if I knew him, and I nodded, showing him the restraining order. He glanced over it, radioed in, and told me they were taking Mark and his buddy downtown for the night. After I explained what had happened, he thanked me for cooperating and assured me that Mark probably wouldn't cause more trouble, at least for a while. Once the door was locked and secured, I went back to my balcony with a fresh beer in hand, trying to shake off the encounter. The next day, the news broke. Hedge fund CEO arrested plastered across the headlines. Over the following days, I read more articles about clients leaving SG funds in droves, all thanks to the company's involvement in the scandals. I couldn't help but think good. They deserve it. Returning to work on Monday wasn't easy, but I pushed through and managed to get some things done. It wasn't until 3 weeks later that I got a call from Sarah. She greeted me and asked how I was holding up. I told her I was doing as well as could be expected. That's when she dropped the bomb. Erice had lawyered up, and they were petitioning the court for marriage counseling. The judge had approved it, ordering 6 mandatory sessions. My frustration grew as I asked if they could really force me into that, and Sarah confirmed they could. She advised me to go, warning that if I didn't show up, I could face contempt of court charges or worse. I made it clear to Sarah that I had zero interest in reconciling with Erice, and she understood, but she still emphasized that I needed to attend. She reassured me that if the counselors saw no hope for reconciliation, they'd inform the judge. Then Sarah hit me with another shocker. Erice's attorney had revealed that she was pregnant. I couldn't believe it. The thought of having to wait another 8 or 9 months before any real legal action could be taken drove me crazy. Sarah confirmed the delay, but added that if the child was mine, I'd be required to pay child support. On the bright side, the judge had approved a legal separation until the baby was born. I sarcastically thanked her for that small mercy as she gave me the address of the counselor and wished me luck. I marked the date on my calendar, determined to make it crystal clear that there was no chance in hell I'd ever reconcile with that cheater. When the day arrived, I showed up at the counselor's office and was ushered right in. Dr. Ellen Matthews, an older woman with glasses perched on her nose, looked at me over the top of them. Erice was already there, sitting on a love seat, looking pitiful. I instantly felt like this was going to be a disaster. Dr. Matthews introduced herself and motioned for me to sit next to Erice on the love seat. Instead, I chose a smaller chair angled away from Erice, making it clear that I wasn't thrilled to be there. The doctor noted my discomfort, but thanked me for coming anyway. She turned to Erice first, asking about her hopes for the sessions. Erice, looking as sad as ever, talked about wanting to reunite, build a family, and move forward, especially with the baby on the way. I scoffed at her words. When Dr. Matthews turned to me, asking about my expectations, I didn't hesitate. I made it clear that I had no interest in reconciling, and that the damage Erice had caused was beyond repair. Erice shrunk in her seat, clearly hurt by my words, but I didn't care. Dr. Matthews asked if I would reconsider for the child's sake. I told her I doubted I was even the father, but if I was, I'd do the right thing and support the kid. That being said, there was absolutely no chance of getting back together with Erice. When she kept pressing the issue of the child, I pulled out my phone and showed her the videos Erice had sent me. I wanted her to fully understand the level of betrayal. She looked visibly disgusted after watching them. As I put my phone away, I asked Dr. Matthews how she would feel if her husband had done something like that, betraying her for over a year, and in public no less. She acknowledged my frustration, but reminded me that the focus should be on Erice and the baby. I told her Erice had a child to worry about now, but I still wasn't convinced I was the father. At that point, Dr. Matthews agreed that Erice owed me answers. Finally, Erice, looking utterly ashamed, agreed to talk. I took my chance. First, I asked her if she knew exactly what was going to happen the night of the party, the one where everything fell apart. She nodded, confirming what I already suspected. I asked Erice if that was the real reason she hadn't wanted me at the party, and she admitted it. Reflecting on the humiliation I'd experienced, I accused her and her friends of planning it from the start. With a reluctant nod, she confirmed it. I pressed her further, asking if the plan was to embarrass me even more once we got to Mark's place. And again, she admitted as much, looking embarrassed. Then I asked how long she had been fooling around with the guys at SG, and she told me it had been happening since she first started working there. I was stunned. I needed to know why. What would make her do something like this? Her answer was so casual it made my blood boil. She said she found it fun, naughty, and exciting. She claimed it made her feel wanted and attractive. When I asked how many men she had been with, excluding me, she shrugged and said, without much thought, for 5 dozen. I was floored. I immediately brought up the risk of diseases, but she didn't seem too bothered by it. Still reeling, I asked her if she even knew who the father of the child was, and she admitted she wasn't sure. She then had the audacity to expect me to step up, raise the child, and financially support it. I couldn't hold back anymore. I told her flat out that I didn't love her anymore, and I was filled with nothing but resentment for what she'd done. In fact, I hoped the pregnancy didn't work out. That shocked everyone in the room, including Dr. Ellen, but my anger wasn't going anywhere. Ellen stepped in, signaling that I'd made my point. I rejected the idea that I was walking away from 5 good years of marriage, pointing out that Erice's infidelity had destroyed it. I refused to call those years good, especially considering that for the last year, she'd been with dozens of men and couldn't even be sure who the father of her child was. Ellen ended the session, suggesting we schedule individual meetings before figuring out the next steps. We set appointments for the following week and left. As I walked out to my car, Erice called out to me in the parking lot, but I ignored her. I saw her sitting in her car, crying into her steering wheel as I drove off. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction watching her break down. If she wanted pain, well, now she was getting a taste of it. Later that night, my phone rang. It was Rachel, and she was furious. She blamed me for Erice's condition, saying she'd ended up in the hospital after some kind of mishap. She accused me of being cruel and mistreating Erice, but I shot back, telling her that all I had done was speak the truth. That was more than Erice had done in over a year. Rachel questioned why I didn't seem to care that Erice was in the hospital, but I brushed her off. My indifference clearly enraged her, and she called me a loser, pointing out that since Erice was still legally my wife, I was responsible for her medical bills. After a brief moment of reflection, I decided to visit Erice in the hospital, if only to follow through on the legal obligations Sarah had reminded me of. Rachel gave me the room details, and when I arrived, I provided the nurse with my insurance information and asked about Erice's condition. The doctor filled me in, explaining that the complications were common during pregnancy, though the exact cause was unclear. I also asked how far along she was, and the doctor said about 9 or 10 weeks, meaning there was a chance the child could have been mine. Despite that possibility, I didn't dwell on it. It seemed irrelevant now, and it made the divorce all the more urgent. After speaking with the doctor, I went into Erice's room. She looked upset, lying in the hospital bed with tears in her eyes. Rachel was at the foot of the bed, glaring at me. I growled a low warning, and she quickly left the room. Facing Erice, I told her plainly that our relationship was over. She asked if I still hated her as much as I said I did, and I admitted that maybe the intensity of my anger had lessened, but it didn't change anything. There was no going back after the trust she had shattered. I voiced my frustrations, telling her that every time she went to the store, I found myself wondering if she was hooking up with the checkout clerks. I reminded her how well I'd treated her throughout our marriage, how devoted I'd been, and yet she still chose to disrespect me in the worst way possible. She tearfully admitted that I had done nothing wrong as a husband, but when I asked her why she hadn't resisted temptation, she confessed that she'd been influenced by others who convinced her it was normal for husbands to watch their wives with other men. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I dismissed her pathetic excuses, telling her that the divorce was inevitable. Any attempt to salvage our relationship was a lost cause. She cried, but eventually, she agreed to inform her lawyer about my decision. Before I left, I made it clear that there would be no friendship between us. Any hope of that was long gone. Despite her apologies, I was firm in my stance. As I walked out the door, I turned back for a moment. "Goodbye, Erice," I said. I could hear her crying as I walked away, but I felt no pity. Tough luck, I thought. Good riddance. A few days later, Sarah called me with good news. Erice had dropped all her objections to the divorce. Ellen had filed a report stating that reconciliation was impossible and even suggested I attend anger management, something the judge echoed, though it wasn't made mandatory. Sarah had also secured a settlement from SG Funds, as well as Mark and Tom. About a month later, she handed me a check, the largest I'd ever seen in my life. "That's minus my fee, of course," she joked. Naturally, I replied with a grin. I deposited the money and moved on with my life, such as it was. A few months later, SG Funds, what I'd come to call Sodom and Gomorrah, shut its doors for good. Apparently, clients had lost faith in the company's integrity. Wonder why? I thought cynically. Mark and Tom kept quiet after that night at the apartment. They both served 30 days in county jail for their stunt and then slunk off to the West Coast, hoping for a fresh start. As for Erice and Rachel, they kept living together, working at some strip mall store that sold women's clothing and cosmetics. I'd run into them from time to time, but I never acknowledged them. For the next couple of years, I stayed single, casually dating here and there. Eventually, I met Lisa Reynolds, a fellow divorcee who had also dealt with the sting of infidelity. We took things slow, spending the first few months just talking, going out for dinners, and watching movies. Knowing how much she had been hurt, I made sure to be gentle, offering support when she needed it. We enjoyed simple things, holding hands, walking in the park. Although I found her attractive, I let her take the lead in the relationship. One night, after a lovely dinner at her place, she looked at me with a playful curiosity and asked if I found her attractive. I smiled and assured her that I did, though not just physically. She seemed to appreciate that answer. Then, with a teasing smile, she asked why I hadn't made a move yet, jokingly asking if I even liked girls. I laughed and reassured her that I was definitely into her. Our journey together was just beginning, and for the first time in a long while I felt hopeful.